So next we move to the next speaker, David Wood, and I appreciate David because he has one of the few pronounceable names on our panel today. David, thank you, Nick, and Julie, and Marie for having pronounceable English names. So David is going to switch gears a little bit and deal with the problem of evil and the skeptic's dilemma, an argument that he has devised to help see that the skeptic really has a problem in trying to argue that God does not exist based on the problem of evil. David just graduated recently from Fordham University, doctorate in philosophy. He's a member of the Evangelical Philosophy Society and the Hume Society. David, as a former atheist, later became a Christian after examining the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Gee, imagine that there actually is reasonable truth there. He's a contributor to the books Evidence for God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science Defending the Resurrection, and True Reason, Christian Responses to the Challenge of Atheism. He has participated in more than 40 moderated public debates, and he runs the website act17.net. He lives in the Bronx with his wife Marie, who will be speaking later today, and his 4 sons, Lucian, Blaze, Reed, and Paley. Welcome, Dr. David Wood.
Well, good morning. Glad to see you here on a Saturday to talk about evil. Interesting statistic, 100% of the people in this room have done evil things to other people. And 100% of the people in this room have been victims of evil done to them by other people. So there's a lot of evil represented in just this room, and we're in a church. So, I mean, think about what the rest of the world must be like. So there's lots of evil, and evil comes in different forms. There is moral evil. That's normally what we think of when we think about evil, is evil done to us or evil that we do. So we have here, ghosts, clowns, little mustaches. No, of course, that's Hitler, the KKK, the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. And that's normally how we use the word evil, is to describe evil that people do. But there's another category of evil which we just call natural evil, and this is not caused by any person to do something to another person, but just by nature, in that we call it evil in that it causes suffering, causes people to suffer. So these are things like diseases, natural disasters, and so on. And the problems we have with evil, one, it can have a massive emotional impact on us. I'm not the best person to talk about emotional impact, so I'm going to leave that for others. But there's the intellectual impact, the idea that there's something wrong with believing in God because there's so much evidence against the existence of God, namely evil and suffering in the world. So the idea, and Dan already covered this, and by the way, several of the presentations will overlap some of the content. I'll be overlapping some of what Dan said. Paul will be overlapping some of what I say. Marie will be overlapping some of what Dan said. But the argument, the idea, if you believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being, you've got a problem, because an all-knowing being would know how to do something about evil. An all-powerful being would be able to do something about evil, and a perfectly good being would want to do something about evil, and yet there is a lot of evil and pain and suffering in this world. So the idea is we've got an intellectual problem. And we want to know how to address this. Now, I'm going to come at this entire presentation not presenting a solution for evil. I'm going to come at this as a skeptic, because there are lots of people who call themselves skeptics. They say they're skeptical of the existence of God. And I'm going to come at this as a genuine skeptic, someone who's going to apply the skepticism consistently. And we're going to see that atheists are going to find themselves with a dilemma. And I don't see how they can really escape the dilemma. But I want to start off by quoting Sherlock Holmes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a story called The Cardboard Box. It's about a husband and wife who love each other deeply, but then all these things happen, and at the end, the husband sits in jail for murdering his wife. And Sherlock Holmes, reflecting all this, really sets up the problem nicely. He says, "What is the meaning of it, Watson?" said Holmes solemnly as he laid down the paper. "What object is served by this circle of misery and violence and fear? It must tend to some end. It must be a point to it. Or else our universe is ruled by chance, which is unthinkable. But what end? There is the great standing perennial problem to which human reason is as far from an answer as ever." The reason I like the way Holmes sets up the problem here is that he thinks in terms of alternatives, right? Yes, it's hard to think of what the reason could be for all the suffering in this world, but what's the alternative? The alternative is that the universe is ruled by chance, and he says that's unthinkable. And he's absolutely right that that is unthinkable. I don't care how much people say the universe is ruled by chance. They don't really believe it. In order to even think that, you'd have to use your brain, which is ultimately derived from the universe ruled by chance that you say you believe in, and so you couldn't actually trust your reasoning processes if you believe that the processes that gave rise to your brain is chance, right? You couldn't trust that sort of system. So even in raising the claim that the universe is run by chance, you have to assume the opposite of what you're saying, right? And that's an instant mental breakdown. So that's why it's unthinkable to think that the universe is actually run by chance. So here's what we have. We have a little dilemma. We're going to have a cooler dilemma later. But the dilemma here is, I mean, think about it. Either there's a point to suffering. There's only two possibilities here. Either there's a point to suffering or there's no point to suffering. So we think about the alternatives and we think about the implications of the alternative. So if there is a point to suffering, we've got a problem, right? That's kind of difficult to believe. If you see some of the horrific suffering that goes on in the world, it's difficult to think that there's really a point to it. So the question is, what would it be, right? When a child is going through horrible agony or something like this, what could that point possibly be? But we have to consider the alternative, that there is no point to suffering, and, well, that's unthinkable. Now, Sherlock Holmes is famous for his method of detective work, where he would say that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever is left must be the truth. Doesn't matter how improbable it is. Once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever is left, that has to be true. And we can modify it slightly for this quotation. Once you eliminate the unthinkable, whatever is left must be the truth. And so if saying that there's no point to suffering is actually unthinkable, because we would have to believe that the universe is run by chance and we can't actually coherently think that, then whatever's left has to be the truth. So we have to rule out the unthinkable option. That means that there would be a point to suffering. Whether you are aware of it or not, whether you know what the point is, you can say, well, the alternative is impossible. Now, the reason I like this approach is many atheists just don't think in terms of investigating alternatives when they're rejecting something. And in general, if you are rejecting a worldview or a theory or a hypothesis, it's important to think, what's the alternative? What are the implications of the alternative? Is the alternative and its implications, are these really more believable, more persuasive than what I'm rejecting? And what I find is that atheists just aren't consistent. And if we can do anything to help our atheist friends, getting them to be consistent would be pretty high up on the list. So come up with creative ways to do that. I get emails from atheists, and some of them are nice. Most of them are the opposite of nice. And they usually start something like, hey, prove to me that God exists. I bet you can't. I'm waiting. Only with more colorful language and several references to the flying spaghetti monster. But that's the challenge, and I never, ever, ever respond by trying to prove the existence of God, because there's some more important groundwork there, namely the issue of, I'm not sure you can prove anything to anyone using the methods that atheists use to examine the existence of God. So I don't respond by trying to prove the existence of God. Instead, I say, I'd be happy to prove to you that God exists, but I want to make sure I'm not arguing with a non-existent person. So before I prove to you that God exists, first prove to me that you exist, and then I'll prove to you that God exists. I call that the rope-a-dope. Notice, see, the atheist wants to sit back and play skeptic while I try to prove something. So I give him something to prove, and then I get to sit back and play skeptic, hoping that he will eventually realize how easy it is to play skeptic. And so the conversation begins, and the atheist will usually start with, well, how would I be emailing you if I didn't exist? And I say, nice try. How do I know that you're not some mindless internet bot that's programmed to send out silly challenges to people just to waste people's time, and that there's actually no mind behind this? That's what you're programmed to do. How do I know that a bunch of monkeys didn't get loose and they're pounding on a keyboard? And I mean, if something as complicated as life can form by chance, obviously some monkeys can get really lucky and type together, you know, this challenge, especially when there are so many misspellings in it. And so we go back and forth like this, and after a couple of rounds, if we still continue, the atheist in a fit of rage will say, look, I will get a plane ticket and come see you. Where do you live? And I say, well, I live in the Bronx, but what's that going to prove? I mean, if you come and see me, how will I know that I'm not dreaming? How will I know that I'm not in the Matrix? How will I know that I'm not a brain in a vat with some mad scientist poking my brain, making me think I see you? How will I know that I'm not the only thing that exists and that I invent fictitious people to keep myself occupied? How will I know? How will I know this? How will I know? And the answer is, if I'm playing skeptic, I can't know that. I can't know those sorts of things. And there is no evidence that the atheist could possibly give me to prove that he exists. And at this point I begin typing LOL. Lol, you can't even prove your own existence and you're challenging me to prove something. Lol. Highlight lol. Copy. Paste, 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 paste. Laughing emoticon, laughing emoticon, laughing emoticon. Some of you think that's mean, but trust me, if you have that type, if you're the angry internet atheist troll type, in order to penetrate this, that sort of thing can help. That can help, right? I'm saying this as a former atheist. Sometimes you gotta break through some barriers. Other atheists are nicer and more reasonable, but for that personality type, some lols and laughing emoticons can help get the point across. So, and the point I want to get across there to the atheist, very easy to play skeptic. But the methods that you as an atheist apply to the existence of God, you do not apply in other areas. If you are as skeptical of claims, general claims, as you are of the existence of God, other people couldn't even prove their existence using these methods. And so what happens is the atheist isn't being consistent. He's changing his level of skepticism as he goes along, depending on whether it's something he wants to believe or not. So human beings have what we'll call a skeptometer. It's a device, an imaginary device, but I mean, we do this. Christians do it, Muslims do it, atheists do it, we all do this. We can adjust our level of skepticism, right? You can be, if you don't want to believe something, you can just be very skeptical about it and demand complete proof, and you don't get it, so you say, haha, see? Or, if you want to believe something, you can lower the level of skepticism down to complete gullibility, where I'll believe any evidence or any argument for this, right? So if you want to believe in leprechauns, you could actually believe in leprechauns. I mean, if you lower your level of skepticism down low enough, you can, look, I saw a leprechaun in a cereal box. Lucky Charms, and it's good enough for me, right? It's a picture of him right there. So you can lower your level of skepticism to where anything would count as evidence. The question is that really good evidence? So we can be very skeptical. Some people are very skeptical. We can be very gullible. Some people are very gullible. But the idea is to be consistent, right? If you're pick some consistent level and then apply it. Apply it whatever the issue you're evaluating. And what I find is that atheists just do not do this. Right? So let's look at an argument. Here's a cosmological argument. Simple one. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Think about those premises. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. If something doesn't exist and then does exist, if it has a beginning of its existence, there must be some cause of it, right? That seems very, very obvious. The second premise, the universe began to exist. We know this scientifically, we know this philosophically, We know this mathematically because you end up with all sorts of mathematical absurdities and contradictions if you try to, if you come up with the idea of an actual infinite that if you say the universe didn't have a beginning, you have to say that it has existed for all eternity. We've actually crossed an infinite amount of time, and you end up with some problems both mathematically and philosophically from trying to say that. But you can just go science, trace the universe backwards, you get to a point. So the conclusion of those, if you accept those two premises, is therefore the universe must have a cause, and you can actually take it further and evaluate what this cause must be like, and you end up getting something that sounds an awful lot like God. So people don't want to accept the conclusion, and so they have to reject one of these premises. Now, here's the point. You have to be very, very skeptical to reject one of those two premises, right? You have to be very skeptical if you want to say, no, I say something can begin to exist with no cause. If you want to say, hey, things can come to, that chair could come into existence with no cause whatsoever, you have to be, you have to have your skepticism set on maximum to reject that claim. Or if you want to say, oh, I say the universe didn't begin to exist, you have to be very skeptical in order to reject premise two. You have to you're throwing out science, mathematics, and philosophy all in one heap. But atheists will do it, and that's the point. So when atheists examine an argument like this that should be obvious, right? I mean, these are obvious premises. You should say, yeah, I grant that I don't see any way around those premises. But atheists will reject one or both of them. And you have to be very, very skeptical to do that. Now, here's the question. Do they apply that same level of skepticism, the sort of skepticism that would make you say, prove to me that something can't come into existence without a cause? Do they apply that same level of skepticism when they offer an argument like the argument from evil, that evil disproves the existence of God? And I'm going to say, absolutely not. So let's look at an argument from evil and say, if we were actually skeptical, if we applied the same level of skepticism that we apply to arguments from theism, if we applied that level of skepticism consistently, would we accept this as a good argument? So here's an argument from evil. Premise one, the world contains instances of human and animal suffering that could be prevented by an omnipotent, omniscient being. Looks like a true statement. Premise two, some of these instances of suffering do not appear necessary for obtaining some greater good or for preventing some greater evil. So, at least some of the suffering in the world, we look at it and we say, it doesn't look like it has a point. Premise three, a wholly good being would, as far as possible, prevent instances of suffering unless they were necessary for obtaining some greater good or for preventing some greater evil. So a perfectly good being wouldn't allow this sort of thing unless there was a good reason for it. And the conclusion, therefore, no wholly good, omnipotent, omniscient being exists. And this is modeled after the approach of William Rowe, one of the most famous proponents of the argument from evil in recent decades. So that's an argument. Now let's be consistent. If we're consistent, then we're going to want to be skeptical, right? We're very skeptical if it's a design argument or a cosmological argument or an ontological argument or a moral argument or any kind of argument for theism. We're going to be skeptical of arguments for miracles and so on, right, if we're atheists. So obviously we're going to be skeptical of this. What would happen if we're actually skeptical of this argument? Well, we start looking for, is there reason to doubt the conclusion of this argument? Well, in order to do that, you have to ignore, on some level, philosophical explanations for evil. You at least have to examine them and say they're insufficient. We're going to get to why that's a problem here in a moment. But philosophical explanations for evil, again, this is going to be some of the same material that Dan covered. But philosophical explanations for evil, these are theodicies. And you can find theodicies in the Bible, but generally we can apply them philosophically as well. But two of the common ones would be free will theodicies. This is the Stepford Wives. You seen the Stepford Wives? Yeah. This is the idea that, well, the original was a horror movie, and the recent remake was a comedy. But the Stepford Wives is, Stepford is a place you take your wife, and then she gets reprogrammed by some awesome scientist who then makes the wife do exactly what you want. So you get to say, here's what I want my wife to do, here's how I want her to be, here are the features I want her to have, and in the remake, it puts like computer chip in her brain to control her. In the original, she gets killed and replaced by a robot replica. So the idea here is, if you had a wife who was just absolutely perfect in what she does. It's exactly what you want. Would that be better than a wife who doesn't perfectly do everything you want, but who actually chooses to do it and isn't programmed by some mad scientist? And people, whether atheists or not, will generally say, yeah, the non-programmed wife would actually be better, even though she's not doing exactly what you want. In fact, the only exception I've ever seen was an atheist I was debating. His name's John Loftus, and I brought this up, and I said, all right, who would rather have the Stepford wife? And he raised his hand, and his wife was sitting in the front row, by the way. So this is wild stuff here. So I mean, at least he's being consistent. He's being consistent there, and he's being honest. So that's good. But most people can get this idea that at least allowing some people the freedom to not do what you want is better in that, well, it seems to be more valuable in a sense, rather than forcing people to do something. Someone who chooses to love others, it seems to be more valuable than if I could put a chip in your brain and make you do something like that. And so the idea here is that if God gives us some freedom, then, well, it's up to us if we use that freedom to do good or to do bad, but the freedom itself is valuable. I'm not affirming or denying much of what I'm going to say here. I'm saying this is a popular theodicy that would explain some degree of moral evil. Then you have soul-building theodicies. The soul-building theodicies revolve around the idea that you can't grow morally and spiritually without going through some stuff. This is Samwise from Lord of the Rings. Remember at the beginning when he's all, oh, Mr. Frodo, I'm so scared of Rosie, even though I'm in love with her, right? And by the end of the movie, he just runs right up to her, right? But what happened in the meantime? Well, you can't become Samwise the Brave until you fight a big spider and you carry your buddy into the fiery pits of Mount Doom. You can't, right? You have to go through that stuff in order to become a courageous person. That's true with really any of the virtues. You don't grow. The times when life is wonderful and great, those are great times, but those aren't. They're just not the times when people grow morally or spiritually. So things like this would account for at least some suffering. You can't say it all because sometimes people just get crushed by their suffering and they don't grow at all. They just die from it. So it wouldn't explain all suffering unless you wanted to put it on a global scale and say this sort of world where you can go through this stuff, that is a better world than a stagnant world where people, God just takes care of us like pets. So those are philosophical attempts to answer why there is so much evil in our world. You also have theological explanations. And these would be sort of specific to a religion. So Christianity, Islam, Judaism would have additional responses beyond theodicies. Would include things like human beings are sinners. This is interesting. As an atheist, I argued with Christians. I made fun of Christians. I never once used the argument from evil. Never once said, if God existed, there wouldn't be so much suffering in this world, but there is. It proves it. Your God doesn't exist. Never once used that. I thought that was a silly argument. And the reason was, I always thought, yeah, I don't believe in God, but if God did exist, I'd be very bad by comparison. And so what business do I have to say God should give me a hedonistic paradise if he exists? I understood, wow, we do lots of bad things. And what's interesting here is many of the examples that atheists use to show how much evil is done in this world, that's examples of people doing evil. So ironically, the more examples you pile up of the evil in our world, the more you're showing that, wow, we are really bad by comparison to God. If we're that bad, what business do we have to say, well, God wouldn't allow us to suffer? Not us. We're too good for that. So we do lots and lots of bad things. And from a Christian perspective, within a Christian worldview or a Muslim worldview or a Jewish worldview, it just doesn't make sense to say God would give us a kind of hedonistic paradise if he existed. And this brings us to the next one, which here Dan mentioned this briefly as well. In order to make many versions of the argument from evil, in order to get most of these versions going, you have to kind of assume a pain-minimizing, pleasure-maximizing deity, right? A God whose at least one of his primary concerns is making sure people don't suffer too much. And this is part of the reason I think that this argument is so popular now, whereas in the past it wasn't. It's no coincidence that the first full-fledged version of the argument from evil that we have on record is from a philosopher named Epicurus, who was sort of the founder of Epicureanism, which was a school of hedonism, right? Pleasure is what's good, pain is what's bad. That's how you determine what's good and bad, pleasure and pain. Well, again, that's no coincidence that he's the one who comes up with the argument from evil. Once you adopt that view, it is a slam dunk argument to say that a pleasure-maximizing, pain-minimizing God does not exist, right? You have a slam dunk argument for that, right? Because once you grant that sort of God, it's obvious that there's no omnipotent being who just wants to give as much pleasure as possible in our world. But no one, I mean, this has never been what theists mean by God. Until recently, you have more and more people, even in churches, who think in this way. But this has not historically been what Christians mean by saying God is good. It's not saying God minimizes pain and maximizes pleasure. It would never occur to the Apostle Paul, for instance, that that's what he means when he tells people about God. So the Apostle Paul, he says he gets the 39 lashes 5 different times. He gets beaten with rods 3 times. He gets stoned. They try to stone this guy to death. He survives it. He gets shipwrecked multiple times. It never crosses Paul's mind to say, telling everyone God is good. Obviously, he shouldn't be allowing me. I mean, I'm his main man here. He shouldn't be allowing me to go through all this, right? Never occurs to Paul to say, wow, Jesus is the main guy ever. Look what happened to him. God didn't maximize his pleasure and minimize his pain. What's going on here, right? Why? They're not thinking in terms of this sort of God. From a Christian perspective, there are things that are much more important than pain and pleasure. And so, yeah, if you're assuming this, you got a slam dunk argument from evil in the world. The problem is you haven't refuted Christianity or Islam or Judaism if you're arguing against this sort of God. But let's say the atheist wants to say, well, no, your God should be that way. Your God should be that way. He should be a pain minimizing God. You've got a scale of values now, right? Now you have a scale of values. And if we're being skeptical, remember, we're being skeptical. We were skeptical of the Kalam cosmological argument. We're skeptical of other arguments. If we're going to be skeptical and be consistently skeptical, I mean, it seems like a paradigm example of something you should be skeptical about to say, I know the sort of scale of values that God would have. Here's what would be on top. Here's what would be next. Here's what would be next. Here's what would be next. And the suffering we see in our world, that would be a paradigm example of things that God should eliminate, but doesn't. Well, if you're skeptical, how would you possibly say that? How could you possibly say that you have an accurate idea? If you're an atheist, your view is that your moral values are either just the product of society or they're hardwired into you by evolution. You had ancestors that had some kind of herd instinct, and we get morality from this. How do you then say, and then I have an accurate view of what's most important and what should be most important to God? So the next on the list would be, apart from the problem of having an accurate ordering of what's good and what's bad, just saying that there are any moral facts at all. Right? When we talk about objective moral facts, we mean that there are facts about what is right and what is wrong. On atheism and naturalism, there are no such facts. Right? You could say you like certain things better, or that certain things help a species survive better, but you can't say that there are things that are good and bad regardless of what people think about them. That only makes sense on theism. So here's what's going on. And Paul, I'm going through this briefly. This is actually a much more important point than I'm saying right now, but Paul's going to give a much more in-depth presentation on this, so I'm just covering it briefly. But the idea here, moral facts just do not fit into an atheistic world. If something is going to be right or wrong, independent of what we think about it, that has to come from somewhere. You don't find it in nature, right? A lion kills the cubs of a competing pride. You don't say that's right or wrong from the for the lion to do that. The lion is being immoral. So you can't get it from nature. You can't say this is the way things work in nature, and there's where we get our morality from. If you do say that, if you do say that's which the atheist has to believe, if you do say that, you can't then say, here's what I know that God should do, that God ought to do such and such. You have no ground for saying what God ought to do. One, to say what God ought to do, you would have to be saying that there are moral values and duties that even God must honor, and two, that you are aware of them. And as an atheist, you just cannot make those sorts of claims. You can't say that there are these kinds of values and duties, and you can't say, too, that you would have access to them, because you don't. You don't as an atheist. You have no access to these. So, if you are presupposing something that only fits with theism, if you're saying there are objective moral facts that I'm using to argue against the existence of God, well, you're assuming the existence of God in arguing against theism, and that's a problem. But this often gets pointed out, but it's not just this. It's not just you're presupposing moral facts. You're presupposing everything else. And everything else only fits with theism. Here's what I mean. Think about what you need in order to have an argument from evil. What do you need in order to have an argument from evil? We have arguments from evil. We looked at one earlier, so we have them. What do you need for them? Well, first you need a universe, right? You can't have things that are suffering and people who are evaluating the existence of God based on the suffering without having a universe for this suffering to take place in. You need a finely tuned universe. In other words, the universe has to be capable of supporting life, so it can't be any random universe where life just can't exist. It needs to be a universe capable of supporting life, so it has to be adjusted, like adjusting a fish tank or something like that so that it can support fish. But even if you have a lovely universe, you still need to get the life, right? You still need to get the life, and life is very sophisticated. The simplest life known is much more complicated than this or that MacBook or anything else. You need that. You need human consciousness. You're not going to, dogs don't evaluate the argument from evil. You need human consciousness. You need human reasoning ability. You need logical laws. You need moral laws. All of this you need in order to even have an argument from evil against the existence of God. Notice, everything I just said you need in order to have the argument is something that is used as an argument for the existence of God. Very strange. So, it's like atheists are saying this. Yeah, you can account for the existence of the universe. Yeah, you can account for why it's finely tuned. Yeah, you can account for the origin of life. Yeah, you can account for human consciousness. Yeah, you can account for reason. Yeah, you can account for laws of logic. Yeah, you can. But evil, you can't account for very well. You can't account. Maybe you can account for some of it, but not all of it. So what you have is, you theists, you can account for A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, but you can't explain all of K. So you need to throw that out and instead adopt a worldview that can't explain anything. Not A, not B, not C, not D, right? Can't explain anything. You see that? If we're examining, if we're even remotely thinking about explanatory power, theism wins over everything in terms of what it can explain. Once you have an omnipotent deity, you can explain just about anything. Naturalism doesn't explain anything, not even a rock, right? So it's something that, again, it's a problem of consistency, and atheists just aren't consistent. Here's what I mean here. My famous Venus de Milo example. Look at the Venus de Milo. This was discovered on the island of Milos, and suppose the guy who found it, instead of realizing that he had a statue, had instead said, well, kind of looks a little bit like a statue, but I can't really believe that it's a statue because I have to wonder, what kind of sculptor make a statue of Venus with no arms? Obviously, if a sculptor had made this thing, he would have put some arms on this thing. So, since there are no arms, and I would expect him to put arms here, I have to conclude that these are natural rock formations. We would all reject that, right? But notice what happened here, right? You look at the whole thing, and you say, look, this is obviously a sculpture. The armlessness we'd have to explain some other way, right? So you'd explain it. Well, the arms broke off, obviously, but even if you didn't have any idea about how the arms came up missing, maybe it's a statue of a rich armless woman who wanted a statue. Maybe he's about to put arms on the things, and then he died and didn't put the arms on it, right? All kinds of explanations you could come up with, but the one explanation you will reject is that it's just a natural rock formation. Why? Everything else there favors the hypothesis that it is a sculpture. So when atheists zero in on the one thing and say, ha-ha, that's what we know about our world, throw out this theism nonsense, that's like zeroing in on, all I'm going to focus on when I examine this Venus de Milo is that it's harmless. I'm going to pretend I don't know anything else about it and conclude that there is no sculpture. Silly, silly thinking. Atheists can approach evidence inconsistently. You have to approach evidence inconsistently when you're employing this argument from evil. And what I mean here is, so think about the argument. I can't think of any good reasons for God to allow all the suffering in our world, so there probably are no reasons. Probably no reasons. Okay, so now we have to go with what seems probable to you, right? Here's some probability. If you want to get life, by chance, probability of getting the simplest imaginable life contains about 250 proteins, right? It doesn't exist. All existing life is more complicated than that. The simplest imaginable life, where scientists will say this could actually function as life, is about 250 average length proteins. You can calculate the odds of those average length proteins forming, and it's about 1 in 10 to the 164th power. To get 250 of those, you need to multiply that out 250 times, and you get 1 in 10 to the 41,000 power. Atheists will look at that and say, well, weird stuff happens, you know, this is weird stuff. They're not comprehending the numbers involved here, right? You can calculate the number of possible particle interactions since the beginning of the universe. You have 10 to the 80th, that's the number of particles in the entire universe, 10 to the 80th. 10 to the 16th, that's the number of seconds since the universe began to exist. 10 to the 43rd, assuming that particles can interact at the speed of light, that would be the maximum number of particle interactions per second. So look at what you can do. Total number of particles, total number of seconds, fastest number of interactions per second. You have the total number of particle interactions since the beginning of the universe. You end up with 10 to the 139th power. Notice, you're not even close to getting one of these proteins by chance. You need 250 for life that doesn't even exist. It's just the simplest we can imagine it. Atheists will look at this, weird stuff happens. Really, what happened to, hey, it seemed improbable to you that there could be reasons, and then because it seems improbable to you, I'm actually giving you numbers as far as the probability goes. You're just saying, oh, it seems improbable. Probability, schmobability, if we're talking about, this. Approaching explanations inconsistently. Right? Theists will look at theodicy. Atheists will look at theodicies and, saying, why would God give us a hedonistic world if we're sinners? They say, those aren't good explanations. Then when you start asking atheists for explanations of why is the universe finely tuned? It could have been so many different ways. Why is it like this? The main explanation now is the multiverse. That there is a vast, if not infinite, array of alternative universes, and we just happen to get the lucky universe that has the properties necessary for life. Well, guess what? If you get to appeal to alternative universes, and you're telling me I can't appeal to theodicies or something like that, you got a problem. But let's keep it completely parallel. If you get to appeal to alternative universes, obviously I do, right? So maybe there's an infinite array of alternative universes, and some of those, God does give a hedonistic paradise. But in our world, God was focused on other things. And so this is why our world has suffering. And atheists are going to laugh that out of the room, but guess what? It's exactly what you do. So inconsistent in their approach to explanations. Employing indefensible assumptions in order to use the argument from evil. You have to say, if God had reasons for allowing the suffering we see around us, we would have access to them. What possible basis do you have for saying that if God had reasons for allowing suffering, we would know them? It's an example. My son Luke is back there. When Luke was 1 year old, the doctor said he has to get 4 shots. I had to hold him down while the doctor gives him 4 shots, and he's looking at me like, what are you doing holding me down while this person's stabbing me? He has no idea. He has no idea, right? He has no idea why I'm sitting there holding him down. If he had formulated an argument based on his level of knowledge, he would have to say, look, Dad is helping this person stab me. He obviously doesn't love me, right? When that wasn't true. I know a lot more than he did. And the comparison between his knowledge as a 1-year-old and my knowledge as an adult is nothing compared to the gap between our knowledge and God's knowledge. How can we possibly say, if God had reasons, we know them? There's no basis for that. It's an assumption that's required for the argument, and it's completely false. It's interesting that even atheists admit that. I gave William Rowe's argument. William Rowe admits that is a very, very problematic assumption now. Took him a long time, but he did. And final point, dismissing knowledge of God. You can actually dismiss the conclusion of an argument if you know that the opposite is true. And you're rational in dismissing it, even if it looks like a good argument. I want to give an example here. Here's an argument to prove that 2 equals 1. If you're not up on your algebra, don't worry about it. Those of you who are up on your algebra, tell me if I'm wrong here. Premise 1, let's say A equals B, right? So if A is 1, B is 1, A is 2, B is 2. Obviously, A times A is going to be the same as A times B because they're equal. So it's going to be A squared equals AB. Third step, you can do whatever you want as long as you do it to both sides. So A squared plus A squared, we're going to add A squared to both sides. A squared plus A squared is going to be equal to A squared plus AB. No problem there. So that gives you, on the left there, 2A squared equals A squared plus AB. This is all very basic algebra. And now we're going to subtract 2AB from both sides. We're allowed to do that in algebra. So we have 2A squared minus 2AB equals what we had before, A squared plus AB minus the 2AB. And now we just simplify that. We still have the 2A squared minus 2AB. And on the other side now we have A squared minus AB. And we can take out the 2. On the left, that gives us 2A squared minus AB. And on the other side we have 1A squared minus AB. Divide both sides by A squared minus AB. And we have 2 equals 1. There's actually a mistake in there that's hard to catch. I had to actually plug in numbers until I saw the problem. But suppose you look at this and you don't see any problem. Would that convince you that 2 equals 1? No, no amount of evidence is going to convince you that 2 equals 1. It wouldn't do it, right? Because you know that 2 equals 1. Well, if you know God, right, you can look at the argument from evil, and even if you didn't see all kinds of problems with it, which I think there are many problems with it, even if you weren't skeptical of those problems, you could sit there and say, I don't know what's wrong, but there's got to be something wrong because I know God. So these are 10. We went through 10 different problems with the argument from evil. Now we have the skeptic's dilemma. Skeptics, atheists, have 2 options. Right? They have 2 options. Either way, they've got a problem here. If they maintain the same level of skepticism, remember we have a skeptometer, you can raise it or lower it. If they maintain the same level of skepticism, they've got 2 options here. One, if they want to say, yeah, there are all these problems with the argument from evil, but I still say it's a good argument. Well then, if that's the bar, almost all theistic arguments are going to pass that bar, right? And if you look at the Kile cosmological argument or argument from biological complexity, all these arguments are going to pass that. If you say, yeah, there are lots of difficulties, but I'm going to grant it anyway, all these arguments would pass. So we would win by sheer volume. In other words, if you say that's a good argument, the argument from evil, it's a good argument. Well, great. If you allow it in spite of areas where you could doubt some of the premises, then do the same with arguments for theism and stop denying obviously true premises. Alternatively, if you want to say, hey, I'm going to be as skeptical as possible of arguments for theism, the Kile cosmological argument, all these other arguments, I'm going to be as skeptical as possible of these arguments. Wonderful. Turn to the argument from evil and apply that same level of skepticism. Is this an airtight argument where you cannot possibly doubt any of the premises? No. And so apply the same skepticism that you apply to theistic arguments, namely, if I could possibly doubt any premise by any stretch of the imagination, I'm going to throw out the entire argument. Now you have to throw out the argument from evil. So the alternatives for a consistent atheist would be, you either have to accept the argument from evil, in which case you have to accept arguments for theism, and it's a lot of them. It's like, there's all I can fit on a slide. In which case we win by volume, or you have to throw out all these arguments, say they're bad arguments because I can doubt something in there. But then obviously you have to throw out the argument from evil. There's too many different ways to doubt it. So either theism wins by the volume of our arguments, or atheists have to admit that they have to reject the argument from evil. Either way, atheists just don't have a good case against the existence of God. So what do atheists do? Inconsistency, right? We're going to apply one standard, one level of skepticism to arguments for theism. We're going to apply a different level to arguments against theism. And again, using that method, you could defend anything. You could defend leprechauns from a picture on a cereal box.